You are listening to the Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. I'm Maria Armoudian. Donald Trump may be out of office, but the conspiracy theory around QAnon continues to affect the country. What's so appealing about the theory? And what can be done to remedy the problems it's causing? Doug Becker explores these issues and more.
I'm Doug Becker. Conspiracy theories have marked American politics throughout the nation's history. From accusations against Masons to anti-Semitic stories about Jewish cabals, the nation has frequently seen small groups of citizens appearing to accept some truly salacious and damning accusations about the government. The most recent dive into conspiracy is centered around a shadowy figure posting to the internet with the pseudonym Q. The conspiracy is known as QAnon, and it poses a challenge for both law enforcement as well as political discourse. A new book entitled Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of Q Anon, explores this conspiracy theory and its adherents. We have its authors on the show today. Mia Bloom is professor of communication and Middle East studies at Georgia State University. Along with this book, she's the author of Bombshell, Women in Terror, and Small Arms, Children in Terror. And Sophia Moskalenko, she's a psychologist connected as a research fellow for evidence-based cybersecurity group at Georgia State University. And she studies mass identity, intergroup conflict, and conspiracy theories. And again, along with this book, she's written Friction, How Conflict Radicalizes Them and Us, and The Marvel of Martyrdom, The Power of Self-Sacrifice in a Selfish World. Thank you both for joining us. This is a really fascinating book on this conspiracy that's really made its way into the popular press and into the popular discourse. So Mia Bloom, what exactly is QAnon?
Thank you for having us. QAnon, if you haven't heard of it because you've been under a rock or something, people talking a lot about QAnon. And what QAnon is, it's a baseless conspiracy theory that began on the internet that makes allegations that there is a global cabal of child trafficking pedophiles who are also drinking their blood. And the pedophile has been manipulating history and politics for as long as they can remember. And that the cabal is comprised mostly of Democrats and Hollywood elites, but also includes some prominent royal families in the UK, in Holland, but a few Republicans as well. So the argument is that not only is the cabal trafficking the children, they are raping the children and drinking their blood. And what it is in many respects is it's a rehashed version of some anti-Semitic tropes, some anti-Catholic tropes, and conspiracies that have been around for a very long time that have just sort of gotten a new life as adjacent or part of QAnon.
And Sophia Moskalenko, is it fair to say that QAnon is sort of part of this is what's old is new again? Is there anything new with this QAnon conspiracy compared to some of the historical conspiracies the US has experienced?
So there are several things that are unprecedented, very unique to QAnon. The most glaring thing is, of course, the internet and the ability it brings to connect so many people so fast. So before, for example, with the Protocols of Elders of Zion, the canonical anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, they were copied by hand in the times before Xeroxes. And of course it took time, and then it took time to, translate them into different languages and bring them physically from one place to another. Whereas with QAnon, it's literally in the palm of your hand, day or night, very easily accessible in different versions, different degrees of depth that you're interested in. So one is just how viral it is, if you will. Another new thing is how many different conspiracies are accumulated under this one umbrella of QAnon. So you have, of course, the blood drinking, Satan worshiping pedophiles, but then you also have lizard people, this idea of lizard human hybrids that are malicious and are going to take over the world. You have space lasers controlled by Jews that are burning out forests in California. You have flat Earth, you have 5G, you have microchips and vaccines and COVID denialism at the same time as you have a conspiracy theory that COVID was actually designed as a bioweapon in the lab. So it's very diverse. Occasionally it's self-contradictory and or absurd. And another interesting thing is that, there are some pockets of QAnon believers that believe in completely different conspiracy theories. So somebody might be a firm believer in COVID as a biological weapon, and they don't believe anything about flat Earth or space lasers or lizard people, and vice versa. So it's a very inclusive, very grassroots movement that affects, in the US alone, something like 30 million adults. So hugely, hugely successful in terms of attracting people and keeping them in the movement. And I don't think we can point to a time in history where conspiracy theory just swept quite as broad a population quite as quickly, because QAnon is only a couple of years old and it really didn't take off until the COVID lockdown. So we're looking at a very short time frame for it to have become this massive, huge phenomenon.
So Mia Bloom, to try to explain what is the QAnon conspiracy is really particularly challenging, right? Because it's sort of like a basket of conspiracies that are all kind of thrown in together. Are there any consistencies that we can say, maybe there's a couple of key points that make something Q? Are we using broadly anything that's conspiracy theory and kind of folding it into something we call Q?
Well, so what QAnon has been able to do, as Sophia was saying, that is so unique, is it has managed to embrace a number of previous conspiracy theories that in many ways were stovepiped. So people who believed that the moon landing was fake or that 9/11 was an inside job, they tended not to communicate with each other. They had very separate identities. And what QAnon has managed to do is stitch together a lot of these pre-existing conspiracy theories. So for example, Sophia mentioned lizard people. That's been around since 1999, and QAnon only emerges in October of 2017. But it also brought in Pizzagate, which predates QAnon. And so if anything is commensurate or consistent or can have some overlap, this is where QAnon in many ways metastasizes. So for example, the lizard people conspiracy argues that the Rothschild family has been in cahoots with the alien space lizards, and it's very anti-Semitic. And so they have that in common, the anti-Semitism and the antagonism towards Rothschild, or in some of the other conspiracy theories, they blame George Soros. And so George Soros becomes the common element. And so while not every single person who subscribes to QAnon believes every single element of it, well, they have the one consistent part that they believe that there is a cabal that is, pulling the strings and manipulating things and is trafficking in children. And then it might be some other elements of these pre-existing conspiracies that are adjacent or commensurate. So that's the unique part. The unique part as well, as Sophia was mentioning, was that the pandemic afforded an environment that created sort of the perfect storm. On the one hand, we know from research people like Joe Usinski in Florida has done about conspiracy theories, and Brendan Nyhan at Dartmouth, that people tend to find conspiracy theories a lot more comforting than the unknown. So for example, someone gets hit by a bus crossing the street, and that's a terrible tragedy, and it's just so random. But if you think the bus driver was aiming for them, then that makes sense. And so for whatever reason, even though, thinking that there's a plan, even an evil plan, provides people more comfort than thinking that these bad things happen to good people and there's no explanation for it. So then you have a virus that you cannot see, that at least initially we didn't know exactly how it was transmitted. And so we were getting inadvertently, because first we'd have data from China, but China had a very different population. Then we had data from Italy, and they had different characteristics. And so we didn't know a lot about COVID-19 at the outset. When the lockdowns first happened, we have this unknowable disease. We're going to the internet to find out more information. At the same time, disinformation is being amplified by China and Russia. And so all of these things together made the interest in the QAnon conspiracy theory, according to the Wall Street Journal, increased by 600%. And so we see that, the interest in QAnon from October 2017 until the pandemic was a relatively flat slope. And then all of a sudden you have this massive uptick in interest, and it corresponds to the lockdowns. And of course, we started to see the metastasis of the conspiracy starting to include things like being anti-mask and pressuring states to open early before, it was ready. And then after Donald Trump, mysteriously, according to QAnon, he was supposed to win, loses the election, it pivots to then be about the Dominion voting machines. And so part of this is seeing how in real time social media, because of the algorithms of pulling people further and further down rabbit holes, functioned in the worst possible way, but also it's the perfect storm of people at home, online more, either because all of our classes were online, our jobs were online, and at the same time, there's a health pandemic, there's a racial justice pandemic, there's a pandemic where people, in terms of economics, a lot of people were losing their jobs, so there was economic insecurity, all of these things at the same time. It's not a good mix, and the result was potentially, if these polls that have come out from AEI, which is the American Enterprises Institute, a conservative think tank, or the Institute for the Study of Religion, they have polled people, and it's about 15 to 17% of people believe in this global conspiracy. If that is representative, a sample of the United States, that's where Sophia is getting, as many as 30 million Americans.
Yeah, it's really quite striking. And Sophia, you've described this as almost remarkably democratic because you've got all these different conspiracies floating around and all online. Is there a leadership structure at all to QAnon? I know the book goes into some question about who Q is, and then you kind of dismiss this going, who Q is probably is not that important. But the broader question then is, who's organizing this? Who's driving this?
This is another interesting thing about QAnon, especially for us, for me and myself, who came into the QAnon environment from studying radical groups and terrorist groups. Of course, we were looking for leadership, right? We were looking for structured hierarchy, some sort of top-down relation of priorities and information and so on. Since we started looking into that, several journalistic, serious deep dives into this question came out. So the HBO did a documentary, Vice did a series about who Q is. And the best we can tell is it's not one person, it's several people who posted as Q. We also know that there are some influential political figures who greatly helped to spread the message of Q. So whenever Donald Trump liked or reposted something, or General Flynn or Lynn Wood, their immense followers got very excited about it, and then it just spread like wildfire. And so these are not necessarily leaders in the sense that they come up with an agenda, but they definitely are charismatic representatives of this movement that brings people into it and keeps people in it who are already inside it. For myself, because I'm interested in mass psychology, it's not so interesting who Q is, because at any given moment in time, there were people or groups who advanced these crazy, conspiracy theories, these ideas about dismantling the existing systems. And it's only when the broader society was ready for these ideas and interested in investing their time and their well-being in it, that it made any difference. And so I am more interested in what it is that made, especially the American public, but really QAnon, we see gaining movement all over the world, right? But especially so in the United States. To me, the more interesting question is, what made the American public so receptive to this message, despite its many limitations, right? What is it that makes our friends and neighbors and colleagues and family members who we've known all their life and thought of them as logical, reasonable people, now speak about lizard people and space lasers and 5G and all of that stuff? That's the question that interests me more.
You're listening to Scholar Circle, scholarcircle.org. We're discussing a new book that's been published on QAnon entitled Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the Mind of QAnon, with the authors Mia Bloom and Sophia Moskalenko, both connected with Georgia State University. Mia, one of the really striking things about this book and really got me thinking about QAnon has been this gender component, that there seems to be more women, who are followers of it. And though we've mentioned people like Michael Flynn or even Donald Trump, the two most visible figures in government today associated with QAnon are women, are Marjorie Taylor Greene and Lauren Boeberts. So what is it about this Q conspiracy that seems to be appealing more to women, sort of the gendered component of this conspiracy?
Because Sophia and I have both been studying, between the two of us, we have about 5 decades worth of research on terrorism. One of the areas that I've written on, and in fact, I have another book coming out eventually, I'm not sure when, on women in terrorism, was we saw how ISIS appealed to women. ISIS, at the height of the caliphate in 2015, 2016, it was pulling in women from 80 different countries. And the way that they appealed to young women, including, those girls that disappeared from London, from Bethnal Green Academy, was, did you want to help the orphans in Syria? And the question is always going to be, of course you want to help orphans. Who says no to that question? And do you want to help the orphans in Syria? For me, resonated very similarly, like, did you want to save the children? And that was a campaign that the QAnon basically stole from the actual charity that is in the UK and in the US called Save the Children. And they took the hashtag and they ran with it. And of course, piggybacking, it's almost like they kidnapped the hashtag, if you will, but piggybacking on the excellent reputation of an organization that protected children all over the world, but overwhelmingly in the global South. And so what ended up happening is that appealed to a particular kind of female. And it just so happens, and we just did a study because, when we wrote the book, we didn't have the data yet. We have the data now that white suburban women who had in many ways stopped voting Republican in the 2018 midterms, which is one of the reasons why the Democrats were able to retake the House, or maintain the House, but also get close to retaking the Senate. And then finally in January with the runoff, we able to get 50 in the Senate, was white suburban women had stopped supporting Donald Trump. And this campaign in many ways appealed to white suburban women so that in 2020, more white women voted for Donald Trump than in 2016, despite their lower numbers in the 2018 midterms. And part of it how do we explain this? And, I worked with an Americanist to be able to crunch the numbers in ways that I cannot, with t-tests and various sophisticated methodologies that I do not have. Basically, talking about saving the children, and all the images of the children were white children who looked like they were terrified, or who were bound or bruised or beaten. This, I think, appeal to women at a very basic level. And, and again, I apologize to the postmodern and the gender studies people, but the reason that it's a stereotype is because, in fact, it does appeal to women to have a maternal instinct, whether you have kids or not. But this idea of wanting to help kids. And so in some ways, it's appealing to someone's innate altruism in a way that, let's go get them, let's cut off heads, didn't work for women the way ISIS had worked for men, but let's help the children really pulled women in. And so helping children, especially now, this is not to say men don't also have a paternal instinct, but I think we tend to associate it more with women. And what we saw was that although Save the Children, the charity, overwhelmingly depicts children of color, because where are they operating? Middle East, Southeast Asia, Latin America. In other words, Africa, most of the kids that they help are in other parts of the world where it's not white, whereas the QAnon Save the Children campaign was 87% white and showed kids that were terrified. And one of the things that was most disturbing, and it's something that, we're doing, because you're an academic, you understand this, we're doing the revise and resubmit to get the publication out for Stanford soon. that there was this meme that they used repeatedly of a child who was terrified because there's a large hand covering their mouth so they can't scream. And in 9 of the 10 instances of this version, the child is white and the hand is black or brown. And so that really does build on pre-existing racist tropes, going back to the Klansman in 1905 with, D.W. Griffiths wrote Birth of a Nation based on the Klansman, that black and brown men are coming for your white daughters. And so that really did appeal to a particular kind of white, conservative, suburban voter, brought them right back to Donald Trump. And I think that that's part of it. I think just this idea that the worst thing you can call someone is to call them a pedophile. In fact, it's one of the reasons why they are constantly attacking Joe Biden and Hunter Biden as being pedophiles, when in fact, the irony is that Matt Gaetz and, they have in their midst people who are actually being accused or investigated for pedophilia. So it's the craziest version of projection I've ever seen.
And Sophia, kind of partial as a follow-up to your question or your statement about how generally rational people, can find themselves being drawn into this conspiracy. I think of not just the children angle, which of course is essential, but the human trafficking angle. I know groups that work on human trafficking have been very concerned that QAnon has taken this issue and made it really complicated, action on this. But certainly one of the most appealing aspects of the QAnon conspiracies, we're all concerned with questions of human trafficking, and the number of people who found the conspiracy because they were concerned with trafficking and then found themselves going down that path. So I guess the question then is, how much is this a conspiracy that starts off with a very rational concern, very empathetic concerns, that then spins you down into areas that can be best described as not wholly rational, if not utterly irrational?
I think it's a very important question, and it's one that we try to address in great detail in the book. I'm not going to do it justice here, but it is absolutely clear in my mind that at the heart of every conspiracy theory, there is a kernel of truth that links it to a real news story out there, a real violation of public trust, a real conspiracy. So, whichever route a person may have taken to QAnon, and there's so many, trafficking is one, but then a lot of people I personally know started out very doubtful about the pharmaceutical industry and the medical industry. And some of it had to do with this insane increase in prices of medical care at the same time as we're seeing decreases in quality of medical care, coupled with this loud and outrageous opioid scandal that exposed just how corrupt and callous and cynical this side of our life can be that we depend on very much. And so people start out with legitimate concerns and legitimate fears, and there's no effort on the side of the government or the medical industry or the pharmaceutical industry to make things right. So they start looking in other directions. They go for essential oils, they go for spiritual healers, they go for religious, healing, and little by little, inch by inch, they end up in QAnon territory. Same thing with something like, flat earth and COVID denialism. It's another way to say, I don't trust science. I just don't trust what this community is going to sell to me next, because I've been burned before by people who are just interested in making money off of my inability to understand the technology, the digital media, the social media, the computers. We're so dependent now on all of these things that we're unable to really control. And so we can't understand when we're being taken advantage of. And that's a huge anxiety that we've been living with. And that for a lot of people at this very vulnerable, unprecedented time of COVID, when we were all overwhelmed with anxiety and fear anyway, it just spilled into the search for some clarity, somebody they could trust that is not of the traditional ilk. And unfortunately, QAnon offered a lot of these things that people needed: this comfort, the certainty, the soothing, the community of people who are also concerned and are not going to paper over these violations that have taken place. And so, yeah, I mean, most people don't start making up conspiracy theories without some real deep grievances. And most of these grievances are traceable to some real problems that we've all lived through and, ended up having some hurt from.
Absolutely. And Mia Bloom, we've got about a minute left. How real is QAnon as a threat? Is this something that certainly you can lose friendships, you can lose, members of the family, to the conspiracy, but does it really pose legitimate threat, to the political order or to physical violence?
Well, so initially in 2019 and then again in 2020, Christopher Wray, the director of the FBI, said QAnon had the potential to be a terrorist threat. And this is partly because one of the early attacks happened on the Hoover Dam. And had he blown up the Hoover Dam, that would have constituted a terrorist attack. But then, of course, we had Merrick Garland and then Secretary Mayorkas from the Department of Homeland Security reiterate this idea that QAnon followers might be so upset that none of their premonitions and their predictions have come true that they would turn to violence. And so part of the problem is, this is the position that genuine terrorism scholars have taken for the last 20 years since 9/11, that we don't want to amplify the threat because it's beneficial to us to do so. I follow the research of John Mueller at Ohio State, and he says you have a better chance of being hit by lightning twice than be killed by a terrorist. But yet, people are constantly amping up the threat of terrorism. And so on the one hand, I can see that they don't want to downplay it significantly. But on the other hand, we've never had a terrorist movement that had 30 million followers. I mean, this would be, if it was actually potential for terrorism, we would be in very deep trouble. What I would say is that the people who on January 6th went to the Capitol and they were Patriot Front or Proud Boys or Boogaloo or militia or KKK, and they were also Q, the dangerous part was the first part of their belief system. But if we start seeing a merger of QAnon with these actual domestic terrorist groups, then we will see a problem. But it's more of this, forgive me for using intersectionality, but it would be more of this common frame. And, we are starting to see some of the groups reaching out to QAnon, but that most QAnon people, as I mentioned, and, I'm disaggregating them from the people who are monetizing it and manipulating them, like Sophia mentioned, most people, I think, went into QAnon for very good reasons. They thought they were helping. And I don't think the vast majority of people who believe in QAnon are also Nazis or Patriot Front or militia.
So the title of the book is Pastels and Pedophiles, Inside the QAnon Mind. The authors are Mia Bloom and Sophia Moskalenko, both connected with Georgia State University. We've just barely touched on so many of these issues. It is a rich book. It is a wonderfully researched book, and certainly raises the importance of one of my takeaways from all of this, the need to teach and to advance critical analysis of any information that you receive, any information that you read online, as a means to try to ensure that you don't find yourself falling down the QAnon trap. Thank you both very much.
Thank you to our guests and to you for listening. The Scholar Circle team includes Doug Becker, host, Ankine Agasian and Melissa Chiprin, managing producers, Sad Dongre, our webmaster. I'm Maria Armoudian, and we'll see you next week.